Here we go. Hello everyone. Hope you're all okay. Welcome to this week's Monday Assembly Ride. We've just got about 30 seconds till we get cracking. We were just before we came on live with the stream, we were just having a little chat about our relative climatic conditions, because tonight we're going to be talking about training in the heat. And if we've got time, guys, if anyone's got any questions about training in the cold as well, we may well have time to discuss a little bit about that. I mean, probably a session in itself. But here we go then. A few seconds to get cracking. 2, 1, off we go. So, anyone that is joining us live on RGT, the course that we're doing is the last 34 Ks of stage 13 of the Giro d'Italia, which is going on at the moment. So this is the stage from Friday. We're doing 34 Ks rather than the normal 30, because as you can see, we start on a lovely downhill. So pretty chilled to start off with, and that's generally kind of like the way we approach these sessions. This Monday evening sessions are a pretty relaxed ride, guys. It's about getting whatever you want out of it, really. So the rubber banding effect is on to help keep the group together. But basically, guys, just ride it as hard or as easy as you want, really. Now, don't be panicked by the fact that my screen is just frozen. It does that sometimes. Let's see if we can get it going again. I am still on RGT. The link is that's frozen. We'll just ignore that for a second. It should come back on. There we go. What was it saying? Yes, so we're running the last 34 Ks of stage 13. Monday is often a recovery day for a lot of people, so as I say, ride it hard or as easy as you like, and we should all stay together. I generally poodle around at around 2 watts per kilo in these sessions, somewhere mid-pack, so give me a wave if you're near me. But basically, guys, tonight's discussion, we're talking about training in the heat. I've got kind of my notes that I'm going to be getting through, but these sessions are intended to be interactive, so do always feel free to ask any questions you might have. For the guys that are on Zoom, just unmute yourself and ask away, or you can use the chat in Zoom. For those guys that are watching the live stream, you can actually leave comments on the live stream and we'll pick them up in the session. Obviously, if you send them after the session, we'll try to reply to the comments, any comments that come in after the session, but they're likely to be somewhat less detailed than if you were to ask as we're going. Also, if you're on RGT, you can use the RGT feed. So several different ways that you can get in touch, guys, if you've got questions. Otherwise, do feel free to just chill out and spin along. So yeah, this was the course that we're doing with stage 13. Sorry, I haven't actually introduced myself, I just realised. For anyone that, because I see a couple of new names. My name is Rich, by the way, so I'm the founder and head coach at RIAK Fitness. We're a coaching group looking after triathletes and cyclists and all manner of weird endurance folk. We've got all kinds of different coaching relationships. We've also, guys, if anyone likes these sessions, likes the kind of knowledge-based training, and we have quite a selection of on-demand sessions now, guys, similar to this in nature, where there's a big emphasis on learning as well as getting a little bit of a session on board, banking those miles. So that's us. Got to introduce myself. Yes, stage 13. This was the one that was on Friday, and if I remember it correctly, was this the snooze fest, or was this one of the very few interesting stages that happened? I've got the profile up. Let me just see if I can have a quick look at that again. So this is stage 13. This is San Remo to Cuneo, and this is the one where they had quite a big lump, about 50 Ks in, and then the rest of it was sort of pretty kind of steady. I'm trying to remember which stage this was. To be honest with you, This Giro is my favourite Grand Tour, but I've got to be honest, it's been pretty disappointing this year. I don't know why I was saying that, but I found it, with the exception of a couple of stages, I found it quite boring. And whilst I love a mid-afternoon nap, I have fallen asleep way too many times in front of the Giro this year. I can't put my finger on why, but yeah, just haven't enjoyed it as much. So let's hope the third week is really good. I'd be interested to know actually if anyone disagrees with me. I know I'm on a WhatsApp group with my cycling mates, and I think the general consensus prevails with what I'm saying, really. There's been a couple of interesting stages, but generally it's been quite quiet. And I know the organisers have been panicking a little bit about the lack of GC action. But there you go. Anyway, so that's enough Giro d'Italia chat for now. I know some of you guys probably not even watching it and don't really care, so so we'll move on. Yes, so tonight's chat, which you hopefully are a bit more interested in, is about training in the heat. So for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere that are kind of going into summer, or in the UK our version of what a summer is, we've got to learn to deal with it, really. And also talk a little bit about kind of when you go away training on holiday, or if you like to do training camps, things like that, and just how to deal with it. And little spoiler, the answer is not just do as you normally do, but abroad. Okay, probably could have guessed that one. So just before we get started, just a quick reminder, any questions at any point, feel free to hit me. So you've got Zoom, you've got the Zoom chat, RGT chat, and for those watching the live stream, you can hit the comment section and we'll pick those up either in session or afterwards. Just have a quick little check, see if there's anything come in yet. Okay, right, time to get the notes up. Right then, so we're talking training in the heat. So the first thing really to deal with is kind of what happens, what does our body do when we're training in the heat to kind of deal with it. And the primary thing your body does is sweat. Now, if you don't already know how sweating works, it's basically all to do with thermoregulation, which is the body's ability to maintain its core temperature within a few degrees. Basically, guys, your core temperature doesn't shift a whole lot, okay? And it shouldn't, because if your core temperature changes dramatically, you get denaturing of enzymes, etc. Okay, everything should hover in quite a narrow kind of band, really. Okay, so basically what happens is, to maintain that equilibrium, to keep everything within a functional range, your body picks up signals from your core as well as your periphery, from like your skin, etc., and relays that information, kind of what's going on around you and inside you, relays all that information to what's called your hypothalamus, which is basically a part of your brain that's responsible for maintaining homeostasis, which is that equilibrium, basically, that internal equilibrium. It's just that's the part of your brain. Okay, so if you ever hear hypothalamus, you'll know kind of what roughly someone might be talking about. And it's usually about maintaining equilibrium in one sense or another. So your brain takes in this information and then starts to compute an appropriate response and sends that response to relevant parts of your body. Now, the one we're going to talk about today is your sweat glands and sweating in general, as this is how we dissipate heat. All right, so, and from what follows, you'll quickly understand just how important hydration is. So when I'm talking to my athletes, and I'm trying to get them to kind of hydrate properly, or we're building a hydration plan for a race or something, I always kind of give them this sort of sweat thermoregulation chat, because I think it really underpins and it really kind of hits home as to why hydration is so important, because I think we all know it is, but I think it's only when you kind of understand at least a little bit about what's going on in your body that you get to appreciate, oh, actually that hydration stuff and being hydrated is actually pretty significant, not just in terms of performance, but just in general kind of functional keeping on an even keel. Okay, so we're not going to go into hydration as such. We've actually done a session on that, and I mentioned earlier about all the on-demand content. So we actually have now 3 series of cycle seminars, which are kind of what these sessions are. So if you go to the on-demand page on our website, you'll find a whole session on hydration, and with it there's actually a workout to go with it. Okay, so you can work out and learn at the same time. So I'm not going to go into hydration in huge depth because, well, really we covered it, and I don't think for the purposes of this session, when it comes to a general training tips for training in the heat, we need to go into it in super depth, just enough. So yes, sweating. It's how we dissipate heat, and as we get warm, our brain reacts to a rising core temperature, and sends our blood to the skin to offload heat from our core. So your blood is like a conveyor belt for a variety of nutrients, but also energy. It helps to transport heat away from your core. Okay, and it does this primarily through your blood plasma, which is the fluid element of your blood. And essentially what happens is, as your blood kind of goes past the sweat glands and the skin, moisture is kind of pulled from the blood across the skin and then sort of sits on top of the skin as like a thin layer, and cools that skin as it evaporates. So it's that evaporation where the kind of energy is released and away from your body. So that's why sweating is so important, and that's what happens in and around your body as it's going. So just remember that bit about kind of moisture being released into the atmosphere. Okay, I'll talk about that, so that comes important again later in the session. I just want to really signpost one quick point about sweating, in particular for female athletes. So we look after a lot of female athletes. Female athletes, unfortunately, due to slightly different physiology, they can find it harder to sweat, and they can find it harder to thermoregulate. This is primarily because women sweat less, just generally, and it's because of the slightly more diluted nature of the sweat, the placement of sweat glands, and the lower ratio of glands to body mass. And compounding that is the fact that women also start sweating slightly later, and their sweat response can be slightly different at different times of their cycle, and also whether they're going through menopause, etc., etc. Okay, so that's kind of just a signposting. There is a fantastic book called Raw by Dr. Stacey Sims. Okay, it's a really popular book. It's pretty well known. If you've heard of it, I haven't tried it, I haven't read it, regardless of whether you're male or female, because whilst there's a lot of female specific information in there, well, 2 points really. Blokes, we need to know this stuff anyway. All right, we've all got loved ones that we, I would hope to have this information. So we've got to read it as well. But also, guys, there's a lot of science in there, which, whilst applied in a female specific context, is also just good science, good exercise and sports related science. Okay, so that book's called Raw. It's a really popular one. I mentioned it a few times already, but that will give any female athletes watching just more information on the physiological differences between men and women, particularly when it comes to extremes of climate, extremes of weather, context. Okay, really recommend that one. So I just wanted to signpost that, because I think that in itself brings in the importance of hydration. And just before I go on to that, I'm just going to pause quickly to hydrate, and just wait a second in case anyone's got any questions on sweating. You will appreciate that obviously a lot of the stuff we cover is relatively high level, dealing with the range of experience levels and levels of knowledge, etc. But hopefully we just try to keep it interesting, really, rather than going too sciencey. Just check. We've got several different things open, so I'm just going to have a quick check of all the different forums we're across. Okay, cool. Yeah, so it talks about sweating and its reliance on blood plasma. That's where it gets the fluid from. And we talked about how for women, for female athletes, thermoregulation can be a bit tricky, and that's why hydration, both men and women, is so incredibly important. As I said right at the top, I'm not going to go into hydration and the science behind it in too much detail, but just cover a couple of things because they are kind of fundamental knowledge. But hydration levels are just essential to your ability to sweat, manage heat, thermoregulate. Okay, if you're dehydrated, basically what happens is your blood plasma volume drops, so there's a reduced fluid element of your blood, and so there's less fluid to help you cool down, basically. So as that blood is going past the places where it wants to pump out heat, it's got less kind of fluid to do that with. Okay, and as a kind of insult to injury, as your blood plasma levels drop, as you lose the fluid element of your blood becomes more viscous, becomes thicker, which means that your heart has to pump harder to push that same blood around, which means your heart rate increases, which also means your core temperature goes up. So it's a really, really vicious cycle if you don't address it. And ensuring you're properly hydrated before training in the heat, it's just so important. Like, you just shouldn't do it, basically. You just should not train unless you're properly hydrated, because you're not only just thinking about your current session. So if you're like, I haven't really drunk much today, but I'll be fine, just get through this session. It's not just going to necessarily affect that session. It can have a knock-on effect to subsequent sessions, guys. And I think because it's not a direct cause and effect, people will sometimes struggle to appreciate that, because it all comes down to consistency. So if you think about it this way, if you're dehydrated or underfueled, you have a crap session, all right, but you get through it, that means you have had to have gone really quite deep to get through that session. You would have had to have worked harder than if you were hydrated and fueled. And so what that means is you're going to need more recovery, because the harder you go, the more recovery you need. It's just that simple, really. So if you go into a session underfueled or dehydrated and do manage to get through it okay, you still would have worked harder. Your heart rate would have been that touch higher. Potentially your perceived effort would have been that touch higher as well, which means you're going to need to recover more. And if you don't have that latitude in your training program, if you just don't have that time or capacity to recover beyond where you might have already have done, say you've got a training session in the evening as well, or first thing in the morning, you can see how this quickly snowballs. Just in the same way as being underfueled, you go from low quality session to low quality session, and ultimately something kind of comes grinding to a halt. So whilst there's not like a immediate cause and effect there, guys, I really would encourage you to kind of appreciate how one session can flow into the next, and hydration or dehydration, as we're talking about here, can be a factor in that, and ultimately affecting your consistency. And it's consistency which is going to see you improve. Okay, so hopefully I've laboured that point quite enough, but just to labour it some more, mainly because I've forgotten to say one point. Saying ensuring you're hydrated before a session isn't just having a glass of water before your session. Okay, there's unfortunately it's a little bit more involved than that, and it means staying hydrated, being hydrated through the course of the day. You'd be really surprised how much of an impact kind of an underlying level of dehydration, even if you sort of hydrated before the session, kind of just generally generally dehydrated levels can have a cumulative impact. Okay, so this, as I say, this means more than just a quick glass of water before you train. It means being hydrated means consistent appreciation of your hydration levels and consuming fluids over the course of the day, not just the hour or so for a session. And there's really easy ways you can do this, or keep tabs on it. Is check the colour of your urine. I imagine you've all heard that one before. Basically, the more yellow it is, the more urea it contains, and the less water, essentially. So your urine is kind of more of a white, transparent colour. Then, yeah, it's a good, decent sign that you're likely to be hydrated. But yeah, the more yellow it is, the more dehydrated you are, essentially. And there is obviously a lag there. Okay, so if you drink a load of water, obviously that'll take time to get through your system. So if you then immediately go to the loo, it's not going to immediately be much more clear. All right, there is kind of like a usual general rule of thumb. Or another thing you can try alongside just kind of general, kind of making sure you have a bottle of water with you all the time. One thing you can do is try hyperhydration. Now again, I've got to admit, this isn't a topic I know it's a tremendous amount about, but again, the Raw by Stacey Sims goes into this, not a huge amount of depth, if I'm honest, but it's kind of like it's definitely a principle that they've tried to commercialise, which is maybe why they don't go into too much depth in the book, I don't know. But essentially, hyperhydration is when you have a sodium-rich fluid. You drink a sodium-rich fluid to kind of draw fluid back into your bloodstream. Now, if you're interested to know more about hyperhydration, I'd read that book. I'll read around the subject. As with anything, it's not a foolproof plan. You know, it's based on the principle that you're hydrated before you do it. Because you can imagine, if you have a sodium-rich drink and you're dehydrated when you do that, it'll probably have the opposite effect. Okay, so make sure you kind of approach that appropriately. You know, you can get hyperhydration or preload hydration supplements, etc. Personally, I think for the average athlete, the amateur athlete, your best course of action is just making sure you're drinking plenty throughout the day, and during training as well, of course. Okay, there's no reason why you have to see training and your general approach to kind of health as separate. So you just because you're doing a training session and it's only an hour long, you can get through that, okay, it doesn't mean you have to go without fluids. Okay, just because you might not normally do that in spring or in the winter, you need to make sure you adapt your approach to the climate and to the temperature and the weather, which I'll be talking about in more depth shortly. So there you go. That's just a quick thing on the importance of hydration and methods to manage it. Just very basic, very simple methods. The easiest thing to do is just make sure you drink plenty, guys. And in particular, in the hours not hours leading up to a training session. So let's have another quick pause and a quick check of the various forums. Some questions come in. Was that a question coming in on Zoom? Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Sorry, can you just repeat that last bit? Only one of my headphones is working for some reason. Yeah. So the question was for the live stream about magnesium and how important that is training throughout the day. Well, basically, guys, magnesium is just one of a number of electrolytes. So the way I think about the importance of electrolytes is they come from your food, basically. If you're eating the right things and drinking plenty of fluids at the same time, you shouldn't really want for electrolytes, okay? And I think this is an area where the supplements companies, you know, it's slightly misleading, if I'm honest. You should, in the Western world, we don't have any really have any deficiencies, or we shouldn't do. There are a couple of potential ones, you know, people that are anemic, you know, don't have enough iron in their diet, particularly for women that have a heavy period, they can be iron deficient in iron. But generally speaking, vitamin D actually, that's something generally in the Northern Hemisphere at least, we tend to be quite deficient in, because we don't see any bloody light for 6 months of the year. But otherwise, yeah, if you're eating particularly magnesium, you get that from kind of grains and cereals. There's also a little bit of magnesium in coffee, I think. So it's important to answer your question, but in terms of taking supplements, etc., you shouldn't really need to unless you've been kind of diagnosed with a particular condition, or diagnosed with a particular deficiency. I think really you want to focus on making sure that you're eating foods containing magnesium, and also one of the reasons focusing on kind of getting micronutrients such as electrolytes and minerals, and one of the reasons it's so important to try and get that from your food is because your food will contain them in the correct ratios. And one of the issues you get with taking supplements is that certain minerals will compete for absorption. Okay, I can't remember the top of my head some of the key ones that compete. I want to say calcium and I can't remember. I'll just be bullshitting. So, but basically, different minerals can compete for absorption, and so if you're having sort of like 1,000% of your RDA from a tablet, you know, that's going to prevent the absorption of other minerals. So, you potentially, in extreme circumstances, could become deficient in another mineral simply by the fact that you're taking too much of something else. And so, the safest approach really is just to eat good food. You know, particularly when it comes to magnesium, complex carbohydrates. So your wholemeal bread, brown rice, basically any grain that's still got the rusk on it, effectively. So I'm trying to think what else magnesium is in. I want to say, God, I'm really testing my nutritional memory tonight. I do know this, I'm just drawing a blank. I want to say, no, not spinach. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Answer to the question, hopefully, I've already given you. electrolytes are important, but you generally get them in the correct ratios if you're eating kind of whole foods, and you shouldn't necessarily need to supplement. That's a very long-winded answer, but hopefully it answers. No worries. Okay, it's gonna take a second to try and get my other headphone going. It's 2 seconds, guys. Okay, I think that's worked. Yeah. So if there's any other questions you guys want to fire my way, if not, I'll move on. Okay, so far we've talked about what sweating is, how we sweat, the importance of hydration, and now come on to just some top tips really. First one is about training indoors, and I imagine unless you're taking your turbo or smart bike outside this evening, you're probably training indoors as we speak. And if you guys are based in the UK, at least I would suggest it's gotten a bit tougher recently, and that's due to the heat, or what we call the heat anyway, and the humidity. So my top tips really for training indoors when it's hot outside, I think will just sound a lot like good tips for training indoors anyway, because the principles aren't really different whether you're training in the winter or in the summer inside, but they just come a hell of a lot more important. And so you know how important sweating is from what we talked about earlier. And so, you know, to make sure that you need to give that sweating a bit of a helping hand by being hydrated. But also, of course, when you're training indoors, having a fan is always really important. I know that sounds stupid and it's an obvious one, but the amount of people I talk to who I'll chat to saying, or they're new to training with us, or to doing these sessions, and they say, oh, okay. We talk to them for like 3 or 4 months and giving them sessions for quite a while, and they'll go, oh, okay, I'll probably get a fan now, I think. And it's just like, what? You've been training for 3 months doing super intense threshold and VO2 sets without a fan? Absolute madness. But a fan's great because it obviously helps with that evaporation of the sweat principle that we talked about earlier. Helps helps the sweat, the fluid, lift off your skin, for want of a more technical phrase. On the downside though, guys, whether you've got a fan or not, they can have issues with all that sweating and fanning if you don't have proper ventilation. Now for me, this is the key one. If you're training indoors, you need really good ventilation. Even if it means annoying others around you, do it and just deal with the consequences, because having proper ventilation, and I can tell you from negative personal experiences where I've done e-races in small flats with kind of very small windows. Yeah, I fainted after e-races, and it is a really horrible experience, guys. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. And it just comes down to the fact just didn't have enough air circulating, enough air moving. So, because what happens basically, if you think about when you're breathing heavily, and this is why you need to take hydration seriously in the winter as well as the summer. In the summer it's very easy, but when in the winter your thirst reflex is muted, but when you're breathing heavily, guys, you can almost see it sometimes. You're breathing out a lot of fluid as well, okay? And so even in the winter, when you're doing hard sessions indoors, outdoors, you're breathing out a lot of fluid, and so it's very easy to get dehydrated in the winter simply by just not drinking and appreciating that you are still losing fluids. You might not be sweating very much, but you're breathing it out. And so what happens is, as you're breathing out all this fluid, you haven't got ventilation, it just hangs in the air and it fills the air with moisture, and basically you fill the room up with humidity, and that makes it harder for you to sweat, and that's why humidity is so oppressive, because when you're in a humid country or it's a humid day, basically your sweat just kind of sits on your skin, and as we spoke about earlier, it's the evaporation, it's when the sweat leaves your skin, which is when heat is dissipated. So if that sweat just sits on your skin, it doesn't go anywhere, and that heat just stays kind of locked in. And so you can imagine that if you're breathing moisture into the air over the course of a session and it has nowhere to go, you're effectively kind of creating your own little humid microclimate. You're creating your own little like tropical rainforest in a room, and that for me is the biggest kind of, well, one of the biggest factors in terms of heat stress and overheating when you're training indoors. Okay, and it's one of the reasons why training outdoors is often so much easier. You've got that cooling effect, you've got that unlimited supply of, well, maybe not fresh if you're living near London, but you know, circulating air that is probably more important than if you had a fan, if I'm honest, because if you've got a fan but very poor ventilation, you're just shifting moist air around rather than dissipating it. Okay, so that's my top tip really. It's training indoors, particularly if you're in a hot climate, get the ventilation sorted. So important. Okay, make sure those windows are right open, and of course, if you want to create a draft, and this is at the risk of being super patronising, if you've just got one window open and the door shut, as I don't have now, but I could do, that's not going to create a draft, that's not going to create circulation. You need to kind of, if possible, have a couple of windows open so that the air kind of moves around the room. Just think of it as like a conveyor belt. It comes in one window, out the other. That's not actually kind of how thermodynamics works, I don't think, but it illustrates the point. The air needs somewhere to go, so get that window open. Some other just kind of quick and easy tips, some obvious stuff as well, but having cold drinks ready. If you're training at home indoors, just always have a nice cold bottle in the fridge, because you think about that cool fluid running down. Once you've consumed it, it's going to help reduce your core temperature, help keep it under control. In terms of kind of managing potential heat stress, keep an eye on your heart rate. Okay, so if you remember what we were talking about earlier, as the fluid component of your blood plasma drops, your heart has to work harder, your heart rate increases. So remember that, guys. So if you're getting dehydrated, your heart rate potentially will increase. Okay, and so if it's above kind of expected bounds, an elevated heart rate is a good indicator that not all is not well. All right, and by that point, if you've gotten to that stage, it's kind of danger zone really. Okay, and now the final thing, I'll pause again if anyone's got any questions, but the final kind of topic I was going to talk about was about adapting your training for when it's hot. I'll just pause, have a little drink. Just in case anyone else has got any questions. So maybe if you're watching on the live stream, guys, you can of course hit the comment section and we'll pick those up. Let's speed up a little bit here. All right, the back of the group. Excuse me. Yeah. So, quick little check. Okay. Right then. We'll move on to adapting your training to deal with the heat. And this is something that I find, and to be fair, I have to give myself a bit of a bit of a slap across the back of the head sometimes, because athletes, and myself included at times, we're so reluctant to adapt our training to reflect external variables. It just seems to be that if it's in the plan, if it's in Training Peaks, that is how it must be done, and I will die trying. And I think when you're less experienced, it's very understandable that that's kind of your mindset. You're given a session, maybe by a coach, they know what they're doing, I need to follow it to the letter. But as I say, there's only so many variables that I think a coach or someone preparing a training plan can really kind of bring in. And I think one thing I say to my athletes is that if there's logic behind your decision, and it's not just I didn't want to do something, then we're unlikely to ever have any kind of falling out. I am acutely aware that life is not simple. I do not expect every single session to be perfect, and if I do see every session being performed perfect, that to me is actually a source of alarm. Either it's a indicator of obsessive behaviour, which can be problematic, or that athlete doesn't have enough training and it's not stressing them enough. Okay, so basically my point I'm trying to make is, don't be a slave to a training plan at the risk of being condescending. Use your common sense. And if I use an example, if you're ill, your body simply doesn't have the capacity to train at the same level. That's just kind of, I think, simple logic, right? The same is true of the heat, particularly if you're not used to it. If you're traditionally not someone that's very good in the heat, if you just know that from past experience, you have to adapt. You have to accept that, say you're going abroad and or the temperature changes dramatically. It has done on a few occasions this year already in the UK. We've seen sort of 10-degree swings in temperature between days. You have to accept that is going to have an effect on you, positive or negative, potentially negative if you're not particularly great at dealing with the heat, and you need to adapt your session. So that's the key message of this final section of the chat for today's session, is that if you're training in the heat, be prepared to adapt your training. If it's an extremely hot day, try to train in the morning. That again, quite commonsensical, but it's when it's going to be coolest. I think often people further that by saying or in the evening. Personally, I would say one of the problems with training in the evening is that whilst the ambient temperature might not be as hot, you might be. Okay, so particularly if you've been outside quite a lot during the day, chances are you might be quite dehydrated, and just your general kind of heat exposure would have been quite a lot. So you get to the end of the day and actually you're not starting from a perfectly cool, hydrated perspective. You've gone through a hot kind of testing day already. So my personal advice is to train in the morning as far as possible when it's hot. Evenings, yeah, but I would actually I'd follow a cooling strategy before you trained in the evening. So it can be really simple stuff like just getting a cold, put a towel in the freezer and then putting that around the back of your neck or something, just doing little things to cool you down before you train in the evening. can make a dramatic difference. Really being strict on hydration, but yeah, mostly the cooling stuff. You know, sitting in if you've got one, a cool dark room before training. It all may sound a bit excessive, but I promise you, it can be the real difference between a good session and an absolutely disastrous one. Just train in the morning if you can. That's my advice. And just make sure you really drink plenty of fluids before you go out. Yeah, so training in the mornings, another top tip. Changing your training, as I say. So reducing the amount of, introducing the duration or the amount of intensity. And that, when it comes to changing your session, can be very simple. Simply doing, 6 reps instead of 8 of those intervals. You know, or if you do the same number of reps, just knock off the intensity with which you do them. So a good example I can think of is that when I'm if I'm doing a bit of a primer set before a race the next day, I might go do some hill reps, but I might do the same number, but I might not blast them in the same way. You know, I'll do sort of 80% effort rather than 100%. And similar with training heat, just knocking off that intensity a bit, that perceived effort a little bit, because I think when you're doing that, you just got to remember that your training doesn't have to be pure hell, just to satisfy an arbitrary session criteria. And if you think about what's going on within your body, the heat, the demands on your body to cool, the height and heart rate, etc., your body's going to be working extra hard anyway. So you don't need that extra effort on top of a hard session. So accommodate that extra effort due to the heat and adapt your session either in terms of duration or in terms of intensity, however you decide to do that. Now, one of the things that many people in the UK love doing, and myself included, dry weather camps abroad. Now, I kind of touched on this earlier. Going away in the winter or early spring, it's amazing. Let's get away from the misery that is the UK winter. But you just do have to note that your body is probably unlikely to be ready for a big 10-degree shift in temperature. So if you're heading to Mallorca, Portugal, Southern Italy, whatever, you know, we in the UK, you know, we've probably just been hovering above 0. So suddenly going to like 20 odd degrees, that big shift, your body isn't going to be prepared for it. And when you do go somewhere with such a big shift in temperature, you can't train as if you were still in the UK or wherever you were. You've got to shorten it, you've got to reduce the intensity, you've got to treat it almost like you would if you were training at altitude. If you're going from low to high altitude, you have to almost build into it, and you have to do it very kind of strictly. You can't just go straight into it, because 120 k's in the UK spring is not the same as 120 k's in the spring or southern Spain or somewhere. You know, they're not equal. I experienced it quite recently going out to Portugal. You know, it was a good 5 degrees hotter, and there's a route that I do out there a lot. But I didn't actually do it because I was like, I just don't think I can stand 150 k's in 25 degree heat at the moment. I just don't think I could manage it. And so you have to kind of make these decisions. Because again, it all comes back to consistency. You don't want to blow the doors off just because you want to do a particular session absolutely perfectly. Right, let's hope the old RGT comes back. Because we've got just about 6 k's left to go. Now, just kind of one final point on the training abroad or training in cycling in the heat, with big changes in temperature. Plan your long rides around it. Plan your long rides around hydration. So if you're doing a long ride, just make sure you know when you can get the extra fluids from. Generally, as a rough rule, you need about 500 mils of fluids per hour. So if you only have 2 bidons for, you know, a 3-4 hour ride, you will need to stop. That's just a literal fact. So make sure you planned it into your ride so you know where you're going to get it. Okay. And yeah, because otherwise you can come very unstuck. And again, it all kind of comes full circle back to my point that I made at the beginning of the session, is that just because you can get through something, just because you can get through the next 30-40k of your ride underfueled and dehydrated, doesn't mean you have to. Okay, that you gain nothing from it. It doesn't make you tougher. Okay, it just means that you're going to have to go a lot deeper to finish that last 30k's, and it means you're going to need more recovery afterwards, and that's going to have a knock-on effect to your other sessions. Okay, I had this same mental battle when I was training yesterday, actually. I don't know why, and I don't think I'm the only one that does this, but I make my own oat bars, my own energy bars. I had one left, and there was 20k's to go, and I thought to myself, oh, I can get through this 20k's easy without eating. But then I just kind of had this battle in my own mind, and basically it comes down to, yeah, I could do, but why? Why would I? Like, I'm not necessarily bothered about the calories, because like I'm going to be burning it so quickly, it's not going to elicit much of an insulin response. So why would I challenge myself to do the final sort of 20k with low blood sugar? There's just no sense to it. But I think we're so reticent about fuel eating and kind of putting on extra kilos. But really what we should be thinking is, how can I get through this session with it being really high quality and being able to recover quickly and being ready for the next one? That should be our mentality, guys. Always having one eye on the next session. Okay, so I really encourage you to take the whole training in the heat thing seriously. Adapt your training to it. Make sure you're taking hydration seriously, because yeah, it's going to be tough. So why make it more tough than it needs to be? So that's my that's today's kind of message. Don't have to make it more tough than it needs to be. Okay, right. Let's try and get rid of that. Where have we got into then? Right, so just go out just over 4k's left of the route. I think let's go slightly beyond the hour mark. But I've pretty much largely finished kind of what I was talking about. I'll just do a quick little summary of what we discussed, in case you missed any points or if anyone joined a little bit late. But we started off by talking about sweating. That's your body's your body's attempt to thermoregulate. When you sweat, it's basically drawing fluid from your blood across the skin through the sweat glands. The sweat evaporates, and that's how heat is dispersed and how you maintain a nice core temperature within that kind of equilibrium, that narrow range. It talks about how for female athletes, your sweat response can be a bit different and can be a bit muted, and you might not sweat as much. And I know I mentioned a book called Raw by Stacey Sims, particularly for female athletes, training in the heat. Really recommend that book. Sorry, I was just scoffing because someone on RGT saying they don't like the rubber banding effect. It's unreal. Yeah. Okay, and then talks about the importance of hydration. So I won't go into that in too much depth. It's all about kind of helping that sweat response out, making sure there's enough fluid in your blood plasma, pumping up that blood plasma so you've got moisture to expel. I talked about how to manage your hydration levels, checking the colour of your urine. If it's yellow, dehydrated, potentially. And I very briefly mentioned hyperhydration, but again, have a read around that, because there is a specific protocol for it. It's not just about drinking salty water. It's about sodium rather than salt. Salt is sodium chloride, by the way, guys. Not always the answer. Not all salts are created equal. Okay. Then we talked about training indoors. Some of my top tips, primary of which was about making sure you got good ventilation. Okay. Obviously, having a fan is a great idea, but making sure you got good ventilation is the most important one. Okay, because that means you're flushing out the moisture from the air, and when you expel air through your breath or your sweat, it has somewhere to go. Okay, a couple other little top tips I gave you: cold drinks, standard. Training in the morning if you're abroad. Talks about adapting your training. So that's just kind of a general point. Just be willing to. Okay, if you're going from a relatively cool climate like the UK, temperate as I think we describe ourselves, and then going to a hot climate, you can't train the same way. You can, but it won't be as enjoyable as you think it's going to be. Okay, so make sure you adapt, you alter the intensity or duration, and really kind of take it seriously and do what was actually realistic rather than kind of what you'd like to do. So not going on that 150k ride with minimal drink stops and 25-degree heat when you're used to more like 10 or 15. Okay, adapt that ride. You are going to be working extra hard, so you're not going to lose anything as such by reducing the length, because your body will be working that bit harder anyway. Yeah, so don't simply just try and carry on training as if you were at home, okay? And don't just try and carry on training as if it was, early spring. The heat does have an effect, and hopefully we've kind of drilled into that enough to kind of really help you understand why. Yeah, just make sure you're hydrated and you look after yourself, and you can always kind of have a cooling routine before you go out. I've done that on a number of occasions actually, particularly when abroad. Just before going out, I'll make sure I'm inside for at least 2 hours in the shade, in a nice cool room. Excuse to watch a bit of telly, when otherwise you'd feel guilty. And it does make a big difference, kind of getting back to a more normal level before you go outside and wreck it all. So there you go, guys. Just got a couple, 2.5 minutes until the end of the hour. Got less than about a K left. So yeah, timed that quite well. So I'll just pause again in case anyone's got any last questions. But otherwise, guys, it's been good. I always do love talking about this stuff, and I know there's a few new people joining on Zoom, and saw a few new names joining the RGT event. Don't be afraid to ask questions, guys. There's never any there's literally no such thing as a stupid question. Any question will help me kind of talking around the subject. And if you are a bit nervous about asking a question, guys, or you have a question that isn't related to the topic, do remember you can always message us between sessions, either on social media at RIAK.fitness, or you can drop us an email, info@RIAK.fitness. Yeah, just feel free to chuck any questions at us, guys. So on quite a few occasions, we've had people email us between sessions, and we said, oh, actually, that's a really good question. I'm going to do a whole session on that. And likewise, if you've got session topics that you want like us to discuss, again, we're very happy to kind of talk about things that you want us to talk about, basically, because that's what really matters. We're always good at coming up with ideas, we think, but obviously we always want to make sure that we're covering the stuff that you guys want to know about. So there you go, just coming into the last minute, last 200 meters of the ride. Hopefully you all enjoyed that. I like the rubber banding effect personally. I think it's great, particularly if you're not a strong one or you're not on a big day or your recovery effort like me. It's great to be able to stay with the group. Got the fast lads and girls on the front of the group driving it on. No worries, Ryan Dart. Thanks very much for joining. Ah, love that. Friends from Belgium. There you go, guys. So there's your set. I'll stick around for a few minutes if anyone's got any questions, but otherwise, guys, hopefully you got at least a little bit out of that. Always feel free to hit us with questions. Good job, everyone.